Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I are back at it for our weekly chat. We recorded on Friday, June 30th in the morning. Usually we record on Thursday and put it out on Friday. I was traveling this week, and then also we put out a bunch of content this week. I actually meant for that water episode with Peter Mayer to come out on Monday, but it came out on Wednesday of this week instead. So I'm not sure if this podcast will come out later today or if we're going to save it until Monday. Either way, enjoy all of the content that you've gotten this week and enjoy this chat with Rob about geopolitics and markets and artificial intelligence and some other interesting things. Otherwise, listeners, if you are interested in learning more about CI's research and consulting services, or if you're interested in learning more about becoming a wealth management client or learning more about the strategies that we talk about and employ here at CI, please reach out to me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Also, I just want to say thank you to all the listeners. This has been our most successful listener growth month for the entire podcast. It's really great to see so many of you coming to find the podcast and sharing it with your friends. We really appreciate it. If you have not left a review or a rating for the podcast and you're a new listener, think about doing so. It takes just a couple seconds of your time and helps us immensely. So without further ado, happy 4th of July to those of you celebrating in the United States. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right. Well, it was hard to tear myself away from Spearfish, South Dakota, where I was this week, speaking to the National Sunflower Association, not least because it was like 55 degrees there, 60 degrees there at night. I'm back in New Orleans, and it's hot, Rob. It's hot even for somebody who likes weather. How's it going?
Not too bad. It's been terrible weather since I've been back here in Boston, unfortunately.
What's it like in Boston right now?
Just sweaty, hot, and thunderstorms every day.
How hot are we talking?
Well, you know, hot for Boston. It's humid. It's a humid heat.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm
maybe mid-80s.
Okay. No, did you know that Spearfish was so great? I'm just going to riff on Spearfish here for a minute because I was there. I wasn't expecting it to be so beautiful, and it really was beautiful. I landed in Rapid City. I drove through the Black Hills Forest, National Forest, stopped in Deadwood along the way, paid my respects to Wild Bill and Calamity Jane. And I was reading about, because afterwards I was like, I didn't know this place was so beautiful, so I was reading about it, and I was reading that the Lakota controlled it for a long time and they considered it sacred land, and then the United States was going to give it to the Lakota, and then they discovered gold and they said, we're going to take that from you. Actually, we're going to give you some land that's further north. It's going to be great. Which, it was weird sort of driving around and seeing these like wide open expanses of grass and ranches and cows just running everywhere and no people. I don't know. On the one hand, I was like, man, I would love to live here and live on a ranch. And then on the other hand, I was like, man, I don't want to be part of this, like, I don't know, complex that like stole land. Like you could feel the sacredness of the land in general. I don't know if that makes sense. It was like a really peaceful place. And then when I started learning about it, felt really depressed about my country. So happy July 4th, listeners. I'm glad I turned into that.
My goodness, that's a place to go to.
This is where my mind spins when I'm on an airplane and American Airlines internet doesn't work, so I just have to sit there with my own thoughts. I can get one Wikipedia page up and then my mind just runs amok. Anyway, listeners, you're not here to listen to my meditations on on the United States and its role in world history. Why don't we, Rob, I think we should just talk a little bit because, Chase was on the podcast earlier this week with, sorry, Chase, but you were on sort of the doomsday tour. And yet, even as we've gotten into the second half of the week, the data looks good. Stocks are going up. and I don't want to just talk about the indicators themselves. I think the question I wanted to put to you was, I think at the beginning of this year, the narrative really was things aren't going to be good. Like there's going to be a recession. The Fed is going to be forced to cut rates. And you're really seeing the opposite happen right now. Like maybe the Fed is going to raise for longer. But like, why do you think there was such a disconnect there? Like how do we explain that basically every forecaster and economist was wrong about where the economy was going? And how durable do you think these initial signs of reacceleration are for at least the U.S. economy?
There's a lot to go into there, and I think it's worth stepping back for a moment and asking, like, why do we care about these things at all? Like most of our listeners, they're not making short-term bets on the direction of the economy over 6 months or what have you. And I think one of the things that I would say is, just to preface, I think Chase is really, really good, and he's one of the people that I read and enjoy the most. But I think we kind of get too far into the rabbit hole of trying to tell a narrative about the economy. And for most of our career, that's been the easy way to do it, because it's been fairly clean. Most of the regions of the world have moved up and down together for the most part. Most of the sectors of the economy have moved up and down together. And you sort of had these big calls that you can make, where either, it's boom time for everyone. It's 2010 in the US and we're coming out of the recession and China's booming and everything is gangbusters, or it's, the sky is falling and it's 2008. And I just think that whole playbook is really hard to use now, because things are just a mess. And one of the reasons that I think people get disappointed in their forecasts is they're still trying to put the data together and come to a strong conclusion. Oh, we're going into a recession. Oh, we're going into a boom. And I think it's going to be somewhere in between for a very long time, and in a very messy and choppy way across the different regions and across the different sectors of the U.S. economy. And that's not a nice story for a podcast. No one wants to hear that. That's not the hot take. We're not going to put that in the title, and people are going to click and say, "Wow, I got to hear about this." But nonetheless, it is the reality, and the reality is that we're not here to tell stories. We're here to act and to be pragmatic for our clients, and that's the messy reality of it. So with that sort of as preface, I think the next thing I would say is, one of the big misconceptions I think people have is they're used to thinking about the stock market as always moving with the economy. And I think that is the disconnect that in many ways we're seeing here, is people are assuming that just because we think, or we've been saying for, quite a long time now, that we think there's chance of a real reacceleration in economic growth in the US. At the same time, we've not been particularly positive about US equities. And that's confusing for people, because we're used to dealing with a situation where we're in a deflationary environment. We have excess capacity. And therefore, when economic growth and demand start to really roll, and you get revenue growth to really accelerate, it used to be that would flow to the bottom line and your earnings would accelerate. And that was great. That's why you saw those supercharged cycles in both directions. Well, that's not really the environment we're in anymore. And I think if you look at the 1970s, for example, an environment that people always refer to as stagflation, there's nothing stag about it. In nominal terms, the economy was absolutely ripping. The baby boomers were just entering the workforce, were just starting to work, were just starting to do things in mass. It was a time of extraordinary growth, and yet volatile and high inflation, and yet profit margins that were going down, not up. And I think that's really the playbook you have to look at when you look at okay, what's the economy doing, and what does that actually matter for my investments, for my business, whatever it is that you happen to be managing. And I think that's sort of what we're experiencing now, where if we have a reacceleration like we appear to be having, I don't think that's necessarily going to be very good for stocks.
I loved what you said about there not being a narrative going forward. It reminded me of Bernard Lewis was once, he's the great historian of the Middle East. Somewhat controversial, I think, in the second half of his career, but I mean, first half of his career, there's nobody better for thinking about the history of the Middle East. And somebody asked him to predict the future of the Middle East. I think in the early 2000s was when he said this. And he replied, well, I'm a historian, so I only make predictions about the past, and I'm basically retired, so even my past is sort of out of date. But I say that to say that, I mean, even when you're dealing with history, the difference between chronicles and history is somebody telling a story. So the moment that real history starts being written by Herodotus and people like that and going forward is when they take just the list of things that are happening and they try and string a narrative into it. And I think what you're talking about with markets is also extremely true about geopolitics, because people have all these data sets that they're trying to put together. And you have a lot of people out there who are telling stories. Peter Zeihan is out there telling stories. Marco is out there telling stories. I'm also out there telling stories. But the tricky thing is, you can bend the data points however you want. You can tell whatever story you want. You can use the exact same raw material for the narrative and put a happy ending, a sad ending, a World War III, whatever you kind of want on it. And I guess that's why it's, I don't know, the sexy part of this job, as you're saying, is the narrative, is who I predict this. I think this is going to happen. And then, I mean, let's just deal with this past week. Absolutely nobody had on their bingo card that Prigozhin was going to march towards Moscow with the Wagner group and then suddenly stop and turn around and go hang out in Minsk with Lukashenko. Absolutely no way. If you're out there and you had that prediction, come on the podcast. I will publicly kowtow. I'll buy your book. I'll sell your wares, whatever you want. Nobody had it. But you can already tell, like the armchair experts are out there. They're saying, oh, well, this shows that there's internal politicking at the Kremlin, or the flip side of the equation is there. And it's really hard to get, like, for instance, I was speaking to this audience this week, and I said to them, usually I start with the macro and we're going to talk about where the world is going, but we have to address Russia. And I'm going to tell you straight out, I have no fucking clue what's going on in Russia. I'll give you the data. I'll give you a couple stories that I'm trying to tell myself to see which way it's kind of going, but we really don't know. Like, here are the things to watch for the next 4 to 8 weeks, and we'll know a lot more in the next 4 to 8 weeks based on the data points. So I take your point there. I think they're in a rush to tell stories, which telling stories is really about crafting meaning too. Like, we desire that meaning. Sometimes we forget that the data itself is agnostic. It doesn't tell a story one way or another. It's just what's going on.
Yeah, frankly, I was a little surprised, not to go down into this rabbit hole, at the vehemence of some of the comments that you got on Twitter, like in response to the piece that we published in the Situation Report on Saturday. And like, I don't know what people were even talking about, but you had a lot of people got all hot under the collar saying, Jacob is a clown and this guy doesn't know what he's talking. Like, based on what? But it really, the public sphere is a nasty place. And for those who are listening to this, it's funny because I think we crave a narrative, and anyone who's selling research or selling a story, they have to tell a narrative. And I've said in the past how when we do analysis at the firm, you need to have a narrative. You need to have an elevator pitch for what your thesis is. So you need to be able to do that. And that's a critical part of communicating ideas and theses and stuff like that. But, I think you have to take into account who's here to sell ideas and research and themselves, and who's here to actually do stuff in a pragmatic way. When we did the survey for the podcast, I thought it was really striking. One of the listeners wrote in the survey, they said, as soon as I realized that you guys were talking through the stuff you're actually doing for your clients, then I realized how legit this podcast was. And that's a double-edged sword, because it means things are messier than otherwise, but it also makes them true in a different way.
Yeah, and I mean, I didn't read any of the hate mail that came in off of what we put out last week. I actually get more nervous when there is no hate mail because I feel like I need to push buttons if I'm doing my job correctly. The Russia thing was doubly hard though, because you have people who think they're experts or have their very strong opinions, and so they will express themselves. But then with Russia, you have that whole troll factory, and I don't know whether they're tied to the Kremlin or whatever else, where people are trying to spin this as, oh my God, Putin is a genius. He had this whole thing concocted the whole time. And, so you had some of those people out and about too. And I enjoy them. I enjoy seeing what they, honestly, I was a little disappointed. It wasn't very original what they were coming up with. But to your point about the public sphere, I mean, I don't know, is it that bad? I mean, when we go back and look at the podcast data, and we've had a lot more listeners in the last sort of 2 months or so. So welcome listeners that have arrived. And I mean, the podcast producer is still amazed that when people listen to the end of the podcast, we usually drone on for 45 minutes for an hour. I'm usually trying to cut us off at that point because I'm worried people are going to fall asleep. And for some people that cuts them out. They just want the sort of sound bites. But, there is a part of the public sphere, I think, that wants people to talk about the messiness, that is okay with people droning on. Maybe there's probably a concentric circle with people who have long drives or long commutes in the New York City subway and can afford to spend an hour with us kind of droning on and on. Speaking of, I don't know if you saw this. This is completely has nothing to do with geopolitics or markets, and I don't even know if this is true, but I saw this on Twitter, so it must be true. It was something about how, like, Seinfeld reruns, they like sped them up just a little bit so that they could get 3 more minutes of ads in the 30-minute blocks, and they were playing the videos of like what's on TV now versus what was on TV then. I wanted to light myself on fire. Point being, if you want to get through this podcast and us droning on about nothing that's important, I guess you can just speed it up. Yeah.
Well, I guess we should, in some ways, be thankful for the public sphere, because if I'm right, we may be in the twilight period of the public sphere being not completely saturated and overrun with extremely convincing AI bots pursuing whatever agenda their creators set them on.
Yes. Well, that is a good segue. Well, here I'll tee. So we have that, and then I'll tee up the news this week that the Wall Street Journal reports that as soon as next month, the United States is thinking about restricting exports of artificial intelligence chips to China. Now, the United States already did that, and I'm pretty sure, I think it was NVIDIA. If that's the wrong company, I apologize. But they dumbed down some of their chips so that they didn't quite meet the standard that they could still export to China, because that's how. So they're trying to close those loopholes. And then apparently the White House is also thinking about restricting the leasing of cloud services to Chinese AI companies. And I am not an expert on this, but Matt Pines and some other folks that I follow pretty closely who are experts on this said that was the real big deal, because that is the loophole that a lot of these US semiconductor companies have been using to still get access to the Chinese market. So there's, on the one hand, we've been talking about Blinken and our US-China ties trying to improve. If this Wall Street Journal report is true, there's no improvement whatsoever. The United States is just completely tightening the screws on its approach to the trade war and its attempt to try and hamstring Chinese technological development. But I think it also segues into something we talked about in our macro meeting this week, Rob, and that you've been thinking about, which is artificial intelligence in general, and winners and losers. So with that segue, how about I tee you up there and we can get into a little bit of AI talk?
Sure. And I'm sure people are sick to death of AI talk, but I promise this will be different from the VC bros on the other podcasts. So I'll talk about sort of what I'm thinking about specifically in the U.S. context, and then I hope you can help me and the listeners understand how you would put that into a multinational kind of competition framework and how to think about it. But I guess what I would say is, one of the big things, as most of the listeners know now, that we've been investing a ton of time and research capacity and effort into understanding better are disruptive innovations, technology revolutions, some of the really, really big things that matter, that drive economies, that drive geopolitical competition. And if you want to see a long deck on this explaining our ideas, you're welcome to go to the website. There's a presentation about this topic in particular. But when it comes to AI, I kind of have a theory. And my theory is that the best corollary to look at is electricity. And that seems kind of dumb because this is obviously much more complicated than electricity. But if you look at the two stages of the rollout of electricity and compare them to computing, right? There's some really interesting similarities because everyone has always said, oh, the internet, it was so revolutionary. It's changed everything. Oh my God, we're, World 2.0, blah, blah, blah. And yet, if you look at the productivity statistics and the actual impact on growth, it's barely noticeable. It hasn't been that big. A lot of people are familiar with this academic research. And that's been one of the puzzles of our time. And a lot of smart people in economics and otherwise have said, well, you just have to wait because these things, they literally take 30, 40, 50 years. And I think we're at a really important stage of that because if you look at electricity by comparison, invented in the 1870s, I think 1880 was when Edison really got things cracking. The first 35 years of that rollout, people were using electricity for light. I don't know if you've ever seen what's the PBS show that they made the movie out of about the aristocratic family in New York. But there's an episode where they get electric lights in their mansion, in their castle for the first time. And I think it's like 1912, right? That's 30 years after really the emergence of
Are you talking about
light.
Downton Abbey? Is that what you're talking about?
So Downton Abbey, sorry, I'm totally blanking on the name, but you know what I'm talking about.
I have very strong opinions about Downton Abbey, but go on.
So Downton Abbey, is I think a good illustration of that. But the point being that electric light was incredible. It was revolutionary. It changed the way people lived. It changed the way people saw their outlook on the world. And yet, as far as pure productivity growth, like it did some things, but it wasn't huge. And it's funny because I was looking at this week and doing some research, ironically with the help of ChatGPT, which I was asking a lot of questions to guide the research. And I found an old Sears catalog from 1917. And it said on the cover of the Sears catalog, it said, use your electricity for more than just light. And it had sort of very primitive kind of electric appliances and stuff for the home and that sort of thing. And it really wasn't until the 1920s when you saw electricity being applied in a manufacturing context that you saw, oh my God, this is the next level. Like this is when it really the rubber hits the road as far as productivity growth, production growth, actually impacting the physical world around us and economies relative to each other. Because if you look at the US in the 1920s, as they rolled out electric motors within manufacturing facilities, which before it was completely set up differently. You had this sort of shaft in the center. I'm sure you've seen pictures of this with all the pulleys, and it was a mess, and it was expensive and difficult to retrofit that. But it was only in the 20s that you finally had that step. And U.S. economic growth, if you just look at manufacturing, was off the charts, completely off the charts. I saw a number earlier today that factor productivity growth, which is a really nerdy way of saying if you exclude, adding more capital and adding more labor, just how much more efficiency are you getting out of each factor of production. Factor productivity growth during the 1920s in manufacturing was 5.5% per year, which is insane. So you're talking about GDP growth within manufacturing of 12% when you add in the labor and the additional capital and stuff. That is a true revolution. And, as I'm hoping you can put into some context, this was the time when the U.S. was the rising power. And U.S. was such an enthusiastic and aggressive adopter of this. It was a major factor in them rising as a manufacturing powerhouse after the war. Germany was another aggressive adopter of
I was going to
this.
say, the United States was one of the rising powers. It was not then written in stone that it would be the U.S. forever, but
yeah. So that's all 100 years ago. What does it matter now? Well, I think that the AI rollout, which for all, just to be clear, this is legit. I see a lot of people looking at AI and kind of shitting on it or saying, it's just a language model and it's hallucinating and all this sort of thing. I don't think that's right. This is what always happens when you have a big advance. And I'd encourage people who remain very skeptical to look at some of the videos of how ChatGPT and similar AI models are integrating with other programs, with plugins. Like, this is not even available really yet. But essentially, you're going to have a sort of smart assistant who will do whatever you want on a computer and can spawn other assistants to give them projects and objectives and have them interact with your Microsoft Excel or your email or websites or whatever you want. That is mind-blowingly powerful in terms of productivity growth. And I think the way to think about it is in a knowledge worker kind of sense. This is the factory of the 1920s. Like, we're going to see that kind of productivity growth for the countries and for the sectors that enthusiastically adopt this and roll it out, which ironically, much like electricity, which required a ton of stuff, it required a ton of machinery and electrical generation capacity to build and roll this out. In a similar way, you need a ton of stuff, data center capacity, GPUs, and electricity to underpin this. So that's kind of my spiel. And I guess my question to you to hand it off would be, if that comparison is valid, then how do we think about this from a cross-country perspective? Who are the winners or the losers if a lot will really depend on adopting and rolling this out and building the necessary infrastructure behind it to actually get it done and use it effectively?
Well, when you said that ChatGPT was going to spawn other assistants that were going to do other things, I immediately thought of Fantasia, and Mickey makes the broom, start going the water, and he takes a nap, and suddenly things are not so good. And he had a wizard that could still put things back together. I'm not sure. I'm a little uncomfortable because I don't know where this wizard is that's going to save us when ChatGPT actually comes for us and realizes that we are actually the source of inefficiency and everything bad in the world today. But I think you kind of hit at the end of what you were saying about where I would start thinking about this, because, and this gets also into an interesting thing about kind of what you're talking about. We need data centers and GPUs and power and all these things that we're going to need for AI to take off. And that requires infrastructure. And the United States in particular is not very good at infrastructure. Our infrastructure is dilapidated and it's falling apart, and that's just conventional infrastructure. It's funny, when you make the AI electricity comparison, I've always made the electricity comparison with 5G and with whatever comes after 5G, because it was, okay, you need these data flows to go together, because then you can do all these second order things. So it's sort of like 5G is the analogy to the electricity poles. Once you can move the power somewhere else, then you can get all of these interesting use cases, which that might just be a semantic thing. But to your point, the countries that are going to be the best in terms of the infrastructure, those are countries like China. China is going to be ahead on all these other things because they don't have to deal with norms of democracy or anything like that. If they want to build out 5G telecoms networks or 6G telecoms networks, or put data centers in parts of the country where people are already living, they'll do it. They'll just move people around, or they'll order, they'll throw however many billions or trillions of yuan and dollars at the problem, and they'll get it built out. Like, that's the thing they're good at. Just look at, a really good example of this is high-speed rail. Look at high-speed rail in the United States. Go Google a map of high-speed rail in the United States, and then go Google a map of high-speed rail in China, and understand that most of that high-speed rail in China has been built over the last 10, 15 years. I was last in China in 2008. I still couldn't get a high-speed train from Beijing to Shanghai. My feet were dangling out over the top of the thing because I was too tall for it, and it was an overnight train. Anyway, the flip side of this, though, and this is why I started with the China, NVIDIA, AI chip restriction things. China's really good at that infrastructure component, and it can, command economy. It can order things in that direction. But when it comes to the innovative side, like who has the best chips, who has the best data centers, who has all the best algorithms and things like that, that's generally not China. Although one advantage China does have here is they have 1 billion people. So they have way more data to feed through lots of these things than other folks do. And they control all that data themselves. So they can use the data and manipulate it however they want. Whereas in the United States, we have rules about that too. But still, like that move of innovation, like they are generally not at the forefront of that. And to get at the forefront of that, they've been relying still on imports of tech from abroad. And now that the United States is tightening the screws and saying, we're not going to give you what you need to make these goals happen. So they're going to have to, rebuild the domestic ecosystem for some of these technologies. And that's going to set them back a long ways because they can't move forward on some of the things they want to move forward on because they don't have the domestic ecosystem. The United States, we have some of those innovative capacities, but we don't have the type of government that's going to come in and command, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're going to focus on it. And I guess this is where I'll throw it back to you. The reason the analogy of the 1920s and 1930s is so interesting is because you get the boom of the 1920s. Some of that also has to do with World War I and the fact that the United States government took over the economy. And so the 1920s boom, yes, it was electricity, but it was also because the United States had allocated a bunch of resources towards the war effort, and now it was the boom cycle after that. You get the 20s and the boom time, and then you get the Great Depression and the stock market crash and everything else that comes with it. And in comes FDR and the New Deal. And it's not just that FDR comes in, it's the Democrats sweep everything. FDR puts together a new coalition of the working class and Black Americans. And for, decades, the Democrats are the dominant political party in the country. And for a little while, they have the supermajority that they need to behave like a command government and in a command economy. And FDR decides, you know what? We need electricity everywhere. I don't care that markets don't like rural electrification. Put electricity, every single town, every single place that is in this country will have electricity because, as you said, it's the future and we need it. So like we don't have all the electricity and productivity gains that you're talking about if we don't have 2 world wars where the United States government seizes the means of production, and if the United States government doesn't put its feet on the scale and say, okay, like we're going after electricity even though the market's not going to compensate for it. So it's that push and pull between freedom and innovation and a liberal economy, but also a government that can, when something is too big, because if you're right, what we're talking about a challenge that is probably too big for the market to do by itself in a short-term time horizon that would be relevant to all of our lives. Like, how do you balance those two different things? That's really difficult. And here in the United States, at least the polls show, like, we're very, very divided. I don't see either the left or the right or the Democrats, the Republicans, or I hope some moderate third party can emerge from the ashes. Like, nobody's going to have control of Congress in that way and be able to push through the types of infrastructure changes we would really need to make AI a reality. So maybe you're right. Maybe it's all true. Maybe it's legit. But I spend most of my time thinking about, okay, we need a lot more power to do this. Where are we going to get the power from? Like we just don't have infrastructure for that. Like, where are we going to get we haven't even rolled out any 5G for the most part, except in some cities as test cases. Like, we sort of have to walk before we can run. So I get skeptical of AI, not because I think it's not legit. It's just I don't see how we build out the infrastructure that will make it possible to be realized in any sort of short-term time horizon. And the countries that you're looking for here are the ones that can marry the long-term strategic vision and have the political capital with their own population to push through things that are maybe unpopular so that they can get to the broad sunlit uplands of our AI overlords.
It's very ironic in a sense, especially listening to the way that you laid out, because I think it's right. It's because if you want to just simplify and say, okay, the US over here and China over here, they're kind of, each has its own inclination, which is completely different. The US is chaotic and sclerotic, and, but more innovative, right? And then China is, we'll just bulldoze you and build whatever we want. And yet, obviously less on the cutting edge of innovation. And yet both of them, I think the key question is like, what is the catalyst to kick them enough out of their natural course that the US is willing to be more authoritarian and build the national highway system or build, whatever it is that they need to do because it's viewed as a crisis. And over here on the Chinese side, what makes things get bad enough where they start saying, okay, we're going to loosen the reins and try to encourage entrepreneurship, and hey, Jack Ma, why don't you come back, and we're sorry. And so it's, I don't know the answer to that, but that does seem to be kind of one of the key questions. And just as a follow-on to that, I mean, it occurs to me that one of the best places to look for opportunities would be nations that are within the umbrella of the US and can sort of benefit from the US's lead on the technological frontier and are within the US sort of sphere of influence, or at least their supply chains, and can get what they need, and yet have the requisite ability to build and expand infrastructure and invest very aggressively, and not a Chinese way, but at least not stymied like the U.S. is.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a couple things there too. You might remember this, and I've made fun of him before because I thought it was overly simplistic. But Peter Thiel made some headlines a couple years ago. I wish I could cue the Darth Vader music right now. Every time Peter Thiel's name gets mentioned on the podcast, I wish I could have Darth Vader music. Maybe Jacob can make that happen. Jacob is also our producer, listeners. I'm not just talking to myself. He said crypto was sort of for the West and AI was for China or communism. And I thought that was overly simplistic, but there is an element of truth to that, which is if you think of crypto as the Platonic ideal of decentralization, and you think of AI as like, well, one power harvests all of this data and like makes decisions from that point of view, like there is something to that. And I was also thinking about that because, when I was talking to the Sunflower crowd this week, I was talking about energy, and I did my whole multipolarity of energy and how different countries are going to be using different sources of energy here coming forward. And I had my throwaway line about how, we should probably be using nuclear, but here in the United States, we have so much natural gas and people are afraid of nuclear for reasons we would need a psychoanalyst to diagnose that, we're not going to use nuclear. It's China and India that are building nuclear reactors. And a lot of people came up to me and asked about that after the fact. So, well, why don't we use nuclear? And I think it's actually a really good example of what you're talking about and about the contradictions of the United States, because the US government is not going to support nuclear. We are not going to have a large-scale rollout of nuclear reactors across the country, even though if you wanted to make the United States energy secure, energy resilient, renewable, you would probably just put reactors all over the place and we'd be done with it. But that's not going to happen at the government level. But then we have Miles, who's been on the podcast, who's working for a startup that's trying to figure out alloys for fusion reactors. When you actually look at what's happening in the private sector, they all see the potential of nuclear. And you've got US startups all over the place trying to figure out how they're going to make fusion and small modular reactors and all these other things work. And that, I think, is where more open societies probably win in the end, because when government catches up with where industry has been, you'll have that base of innovation to rely on, where that's much harder to say. And I don't want to say China's not innovative, because I think that's also a mistake. There's a lot of innovation in the Chinese economy, but they're not at the forefront. I don't think it's controversial to say they're not at the forefront of a lot of these different things. And then just the last thought I would say, and this is something I've said sort of over the last couple of years as I've tried to think about this, which is, we're in a globalization era. And so we could probably get to what you're talking about with AI much faster if we all double down on globalization. Because right now, the semiconductor supply chain, all these supply chains for the infrastructure that we're talking about, was all globalized. It's all, this part is in Japan, and this part's in South Korea, and this part's in Taiwan, and this is assembled in China, and the design is over here in the United States. And I'm sure the Europeans contribute something too. I just don't know exactly what it is. Sorry, Europeans. But that's all going away. Now we're talking about tech sovereignty and about domestic supply chains and nearshoring and reshoring, and all of that now has to shake out before we can get to what you're talking about. And when you go back to previous periods in history where you have this kind of exponential technological change, the advent of steam power, for example, it's not like, okay, there was steam power and then there was a bunch of productivity and the economy went great. there was the advent of steam power, and then there was the French Revolution and the U.S. Revolution and all these different wars. And then you got a period of sort of relative peace and prosperity. Same with electricity. Like you get electricity, and then what do you get? World War II, fighting all over the place for energy resources that you need for this new industrial economy. So I think the geopolitical perspective is that there is going to be this sort of battle between rising powers for who's going to control these sorts of areas. And, we focus on the United States, we focus on China. This is where, and we've been very ambivalent on this podcast about India. This is where India starts to shine, because India is deepening relations with the United States, does have that, massive group of laborers that the United States just doesn't have. Like, if India is going to align a little bit more with the United States, they have a lot of the fundamentals that you would want from a country that's going to be able to take advantage of this. Russia's not going to be able to do it, but Russia was trying to build this kind of tech ecosystem in their own country as well. I think Turkey has some sense that this is the direction that they want to go into. I have my finger less on the pulse of whether Brazil can think about this. They're probably not in terms of tech, like even close to what we're talking about here. And in some ways, like their pragmatic position between the United States and China, they don't want to pick sides. Like, I don't know, but that's the profile of the types of countries I think that you're looking for, that have the requisite resources and either, the innovative capacity themselves or the ability to acquire the intellectual property they need to push the ball forward.
Yeah, I think you're right that you have to, if you had to choose between one approach or the other, I think you have to choose the U.S. approach, because having that innovation, even if it is in the context of a system that really struggles to do things sometimes, having that innovation is like you've caught lightning in a bottle. And it's shocking how rare and unique that is globally to find sort of, like, there's no other Silicon Valley, there's no other Cambridge, Massachusetts, where everyone is just like, it's almost annoying. Frankly, I come back from France, and I'm always, when I'm there, I'm like, God, I really miss being around people who are ambitious and doing things and they want to build, blah, blah, blah. And then I come here and I'm just like, enough. Like, I'm sick of hearing about your startup, and everyone's talking constantly about microchips and, genetic analysis and, anyway. I'm going off on a tangent here, but my point being that it seems like a better bet that the U.S. can find ways to get around that sclerosis than China can push that innovative edge to the top tier where the U.S.
And I think there's one more way to think about this, and this is reflected in the strategic wealth strategy that we have right now, which is, you've already alluded to the massive amount of back-end infrastructure that's going to be necessary to actually use AI and all these other sort of things that are, automation, the data economy. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to go into that. And one idea I've also been playing with for a couple of years now is that, we might see the rise of city-states again, because if you have a powerful city-state that is able to roll out this type of infrastructure in the city itself and make the city wealthier and more productive, and it doesn't have to worry about large-scale war or anything like that, it can operate in the center there. You might see city-states that in some ways are taking off ahead of either of other large countries. So, I mean, again, think about the United States. It's a massive country. So even if you have all the innovation in the world in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I was just in South Dakota. It's funny. I would go back to South Dakota because there were no people there, and that was great. I would rather just commune with the cows in the field. That sounds wonderful to me. But you have to roll it out in a really, really huge way on a huge scale. Whereas if you're a Singapore, or if you're, I know it's really hard to find other analogs. Singapore is the one that first comes to mind. But if you're a Singapore and you decide, we want to be smart city, AI city, we're going to do this first. It's a lower lift. Like, you can build out like that infrastructure in a much easier way. So I wonder if we will get the rise, at least, before, hopefully we don't get to any type of World War III scenario, but before we get to the sort of global conflict, scary scenario emerging, you could see the rise of these types of really powerful cities, and the cities that can invest in this type of infrastructure may do really well going forward. So.
And you've been talking recently about the geopolitics within nations and how interesting that is. And it seems, I don't have data to back this up, but my gut sense is that sort of policy innovation is accelerating across different states of the U.S. and different regions. You have California experimenting with whatever kind of kooky stuff they're doing. You have Texas doing very different things. Do you think that provides scope for more innovative states to sort of grab the bull by the horns, and which I guess would be a Texas thing, and really sort of buck a national trend and get things done in a way that's more local, like a city state would?
Maybe, but then again, I mean, both of the examples you use, Texas and California, those are huge states. That's a lot of infrastructure layout, and there's a lot of different politics and things like that. And also, I mean, this sort of thing also causes lots of internal friction. So look at the UK, for example. London voted against Brexit, and London voted against Brexit because London was the chief benefactor of the age of globalization and being the way station between the EU and the Western world, and London prospered immensely. And the UK prospered immensely because London prospered immensely, but the rest of the UK did not prosper as much. So part of what was in the Brexit vote, I think it was primarily about migration and some other sort of domestic political things at the time. But part of it was the rest of the UK looking at London and not even recognizing it, saying, this is an English city? Like, what is this? There's the real estate is super expensive. People are buying up all the best places. I don't recognize anyone here. This doesn't make sense. And I think that's why you got in this clash between the rest of England and with London itself over the issue of Brexit. Brexit was a really interesting laboratory for what we're talking about, because you had, I mean, thanks David Cameron for just saying we're going to hold this referendum. You get to see all these political forces going forward. But I think you would see a similar dynamic in Texas. Like, look at what's happening in the capital, Austin, versus what's happening in the rest of the state. Look at what's happening in the cities in California versus different other parts of California that are very farm intensive or agriculture intensive or depend more on migrant, so there's a lot of divisions there. And I think it's going to cause a lot of friction, especially in these larger countries where you're trying to deal with, both cities and, rural areas and trying to make those things work, which is why I say, if you're just a city state, you don't have to worry about some kind of hinterland or, a raising tide lifting all boats. You can make those decisions without having to worry about the rest of the state. So that's why smaller scale countries might be at the forefront here, because they can roll this stuff out first. And then the larger countries can adopt it when they see the proof of their works or when they figure out how to make it work for the national economy in general. So by that logic, you might be looking for a smaller state rather than a big one that has the resources of a Texas or California. Look for a smaller state that is forward thinking, that is able to invest in this type of infrastructure and then roll it out going forward. If that thesis is right, it might not be correct, but that's where that's how I would respond to what you said.
Well, I wonder too also, if you see increasingly ways to get around some of these bottlenecks. So traditionally, we think of infrastructure, we think of big interconnected systems that require a centralizing authority to put them in place and maintain them. And in many ways, that's still true. But let me give two examples of things that I find interesting to think about that are counter to that trend. Number one is SpaceX and Starlink. I mean, high-speed internet is the quintessential infrastructure example. You literally have to dig up under the roads and lay the fiber, and I mean, it's a nightmare. It's an extremely expensive nightmare. And now you have this company that's emerged, that's a private company, and obviously you can provide internet to war-torn areas of Ukraine. And if you are in the US and you're not on the fiber grid, you can get a Starlink unit. And I saw someone posted their download speeds, I think it was like 170 megabytes per second on their Starlink unit. I saw it just last week. So as technology improves, is it naturally decentralizing in some ways where you can innovate around some of those institutional bottlenecks? And the other example, I try not to talk too much about specific investments that we make here, because I don't want people to think that we're necessarily talking our book. And frankly, we've try to keep some of that close to the chest. But this is such a good
we
example.
also want people to be clients if they get access to those ideas. But I hear you.
Well, yeah. Well, we have a lot of investments, so we can talk about one. I don't think we're going to be giving the game away. But this is such a great example of what I'm talking about that I can't help myself, which is Bloom Energy. So our CI innovation strategy, which essentially tries to research and identify these trends that we're talking about right now and figure out, okay, well, which companies, both large and smaller, are positioned on the right side of history. Which ones, if you were to own them today, would you want to, put it in a lockbox and 15 years from now, open it up and say, oh yeah, they got that trend right. That big exponentially growing trend that everyone was talking about. And so we just added Bloom Energy to the CI innovation strategy. And the reason why I say it's an interesting example of this is because, for those who don't know, Bloom Energy makes fuel cells, and they're primarily known as a hydrogen fuel cell company. So you take hydrogen, use it as an input to the fuel cell generates electricity. And these are not for mobility applications. You're not going to put this on a car. This is for data centers, industrial sites, that kind of thing, where you need power on site and you need a lot of power. And the reason why this is an interesting one, because it's not just hydrogen. They can use natural gas, they can use methane, there's all sorts of fuel stocks, biogas that they can use. So it's very flexible. But one of the things we like most about it is they seem to express this innovation around the bottleneck idea, because a large part of why there's great demand for something that Bloom Energy creates, where you put one of these fuel cells on your industrial site and it's basically getting you off the grid, is because a lot of these sites are building infrastructure on site and they need more electricity and they can't get it. They can't get it because the local grid can't produce enough, because they can't authorize and build the connections from the generation capacity to the site in an expeditious way that doesn't take years and environmental reviews and permitting delays and et cetera. And this is an innovative solution around it. Why go to the grid if you can build on site and just bypass all that? And as a result, these guys are seeing enormous demand for what they do, which is a new technology called solid oxide fuel cells. So it gives hope that there are innovative solutions around some of these problems that we're constantly complaining about. So that's one way to look at it.
Well, and eventually the U.S. government and Western governments, they will get hip to this eventually. I mean, this is one of the other problems with the U.S. government right now. I mean, we've got are both Trump and Biden going to be in their 80s when the next presidential term starts? And I don't know if you saw that. I can't remember if it was a House or a Senate meeting or something like that. And one of the senators or House members, had to stop the guy who was presenting and say, and what is a Substack? And it's like, okay, so like, are we're going to roll out AI, or we're just going to have congressional meetings about Substack and what that is? Rob, before we get out of here, I have to go in a second, but you're in the U.S. now, but you're headed back to France on Monday. Anything to say about all the protests in France? Everybody good in Paris back home? Are you worried at all, or is this just the traditional French way to celebrate American independence?
So I think, first of all, I get these messages all the time when I'm over there, and I'm sure any American who lives there does, where people see something on the news and say, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And you're not even aware of that's going on. This is happening, but the French are very funny in that way. And just getting back to the protests over the pension reform, for example, right, which were very raucous, lots of cars getting burned, and similar sort of situation. These things it's really hard to explain. In the case of the pension reform, a lot of that is so choreographed, for example, sort of choreographed shows of revolution or violence. And you don't get the sense that things are out of control when you're there and you're experiencing these things. You get the sense that this is almost like a dance going on. Now, this with the Baidu and these things inevitably happen. Every year or two, there's some incident, some kid gets shot. There's something that inflames tensions, and there's a lot of violence and issues like that. It's not a sign of instability per se. It's a sign, I think, the French, and I'm sort of ranting here, but what I mean to say is, as Americans, in my experience, we're used to thinking of things being like kind of wild and chaotic. Like, you don't know who's your friend, you don't know what your relationship is. Like, this guy who's dressed like a slob could be Mark Zuckerberg. You don't even know about it. Like, it's not clear. There's not a structured society that we have. Every state has its own laws. They're all a mess. So, like, there's weird laws in Massachusetts. You can't buy a beer because of some shit from 1682. And like, that's what we're used to. And we're used to instability being sort of the norm. Whereas France, I think the way to think about French society, and this is going to sound so presumptuous that I'm saying how to think about French society, but think of it like a beautifully crafted machine that needs to let off steam. Things are much more structured, much more rigid in both good and bad ways, because that rigidity can be a huge asset in many ways. But it also means that you don't get the kind of instability. Like, this is the letting off of the steam, the pension reform, people burning cars, turning them over in the street. That's the system working the way it's supposed to work, in my view. That's how they express, let out the pressure that otherwise would build up, too many levels of protocol in day-to-day life. People's heads would explode if they can't go crazy every once in a while. But the issues with the Baidu I think are representative of this, because these are people who are outside of that beautiful machine, and they don't know how to get in, and there's no real mechanism for them to get in. It's not like the United States. It's not like you can move to suburban Virginia from Somalia, and in 5 years, you're pretty much American, like, in many ways. Like, there, it just doesn't work that way. It's really, really, really hard to get into that beautifully crafted machine if you're outside of it, and especially if you're not French. So I guess I'll shut up now, but basically the two takeaways are: A, it's not as big a deal as it looks like on TV, and B, it is a real problem, and it's not a problem that's very easily solvable, and it probably won't go away anytime soon.
I think that's a great take, and I'll close by just saying this is another way in which the United States and most English-speaking countries have such an advantage, which is they can assimilate immigrants, which even, liberal democratic Western society like France really can't. To give you a tangible example, my grandfather, who ran away from Austria and the Anschluss, went to France because he thought he'd be safe in France. That wasn't the best decision in the world, but fought in the French army for as long as it lasted. I have his papers and his orders and everything that he did. He's not considered French. He couldn't have claimed French citizenship. Like, his service in the French army, not even that qualified him to be French. You needed so and so many relatives born here, blah, blah, blah. Just to say that, like, it's really, really tough to become French. You can even bleed for France, and you're not going to be entitled to it. And I forget, they've tried to sample what percent of the population is like this, but they can't, because France is so rigidly secular that they literally won't take census data about who is, like, where they're coming from, and are you Muslim or are you not Muslim, and things like that. So they don't even have a sense of the scope of the problem that they're dealing with there. So, just to say that,
which is so ironic. Just to jump in, it's so ironic because France itself, the people who are quote unquote French, are completely different from each other. If you go to the north, or you go to the southwest, you go to Provence, you go to Brittany, these are not unified people. And the whole history of France is basically the history of Paris trying to smash everyone and get them, within this unified structure, and, push down their local dialects and customs, and every school child's going to learn the same thing at the same moment, and the clocks and the trains will always run simultaneously on time. It's not like this is a nation. It's not like these are the Austrians or something where everyone has this kind of very unified way of doing things. Like it's almost like Spain in that way, where it's just so different. And yet they've crafted this national identity, this national way of doing things out of those disparate elements. Like just going to Corsica on vacation was crazy. There's such an enormous independence drive. They're so resentful of being French, and you can just see the elements of just, boom, we're going to basically punch you in the face for 200 years until you say bonjour the right way. And you know what I mean? And I don't mean to shit on that system, because it works in many ways, and I think it's geographically necessary for them to have done that. But it is ironic.
Right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Liberty, fraternity, equality. Like, this was all about equality. The French approach to secularism was to enforce equality, so that we're all going to be equal. If you are French, if you get the label, like, secularism just means that, like, you can do whatever you want in private, but in public we are all going to be the same. And maybe an interesting place to stop and plant a seed for the future is one country that really liked the French approach to secularism when it was setting up its modern republic was Turkey. The Turkish approach to secularism was stolen from the French, and they tried to apply it in that particular way. And the rise of Erdogan and all the political instability you've seen in Turkey is actually a revolt against secularism defined in that way, where we don't have to be that rigid. We need to have ways to express ourselves in these different ways. And why can't that be part of the national conversation? So I think you're right that it works for France, but that approach to secularism, well, we could talk for hours about that, but we should probably put a pin in it there. Anything else you want to say to the listeners, Rob, before we get out of here?
No, let's do it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.